Good morning. I'm John Schumann, Associate Professor of Political Science at the College of Florida, Madison, at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And it's our great pleasure to host this UN Pathways video conference on the Arab Spring. Welcome, everybody. We are particularly fortunate this morning to have not one, but two ambassadors from the UN participating with us. The first is Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, from the permanent mission to Saudi Arabia. And the second is Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, for the permanent mission of Egypt. Our guest universities are Arizona State University, the Bronx Community College, Lehigh University, Lock Haven University, Montclair High School, Towson University, and three campuses of FDU, one in Vancouver, one in Metro, and right here at the College of Florida in Madison. I'd now like to turn it over to our own Ambassador Kamal and thank him for leading the first part of our discussion with the ambassadors, and also thanks to the Ambassadors Club at the UN for hosting this. Ambassador Kamal.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, almost half a dozen or a dozen universities, on a matter of very great topical importance, namely the developments in the Arab world and their impact not just on the Arab world but beyond the Arab world also. And we have two pillars of the United Nations with us here. Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, who is the permanent representative of Egypt, who is well known to all these universities because he has participated before. And I want to remind you that he is a senior ambassador here, and out of the 14 ambassadors who have been Egyptian ambassadors at the United Nations, 8 have become foreign ministers of the country. So this is the potential future foreign minister of Egypt as a result of the developments in the Middle East. Next to him is Ambassador Al-Muallimi of Saudi Arabia, which is in its own way a center of the Arab world because of the importance of Mecca and Medina, and because of the enormous reserves of oil and the role that gives it, along with the population, as a center of gravity in the Arab world and certainly in the Gulf. And so we have a number of questions that we would like to address, and I will ask both of them one by one to come in first. But my two questions, the ones that I really am interested in, the first is to Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, and the second will be to Ambassador Al-Muallimi. To Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, I would like to ask, what is this frustration among the youth in Egypt? And I ask Egypt particularly because of all the countries in the Arab world, Egypt has a critical mass of population. It has 80 million plus people. It has a critical mass in the intellectual history of the country because it has the oldest university, it has a highly educated population, and therefore it has an effervescence which has been very visible in the Arab world. And so what happens in Egypt, much more than what happens in Tunisia or Syria or Yemen or anywhere else, what happens in Egypt is going to determine what ultimately happens in this part of the world and beyond. And so how does it happen that so many people are frustrated in Egypt? Are they frustrated because of unemployment? Are they frustrated, in other words, economic reasons? Are they frustrated because of a power structure in which the youth does not have full participation in decision making, which is too much a decision making by the elite? And so what happened and what is happening, because it appears to me that the game has not been played out yet in Egypt. For Saudi Arabia, my question is slightly different. If for one, what is happening in the Arab world is a prolongation of the revolutions that we've seen in the world throughout history. They started with Spartacus revolting against the Romans. Then we saw the American Revolution against a British monarch. Then we saw the American Revolution, which was a revolt against a British monarchy, which did not know how to drink tea properly. And then you had the French Revolution against a king who did not know the difference between bread and cake. Then you had the Russian Soviet Revolution, in which you had an imperial czar who had to be thrown out with power coming to the people. Then you had the Chinese Revolution, which was the same. Chinese people revolting against outside interference, which had converted a great power like China into a nation of opium eaters. Then you had the Iranian Revolution, once again against a king who did not quite have his finger on the pulse of the population. Now, all these revolutions went through a process of readjustment. The American Revolution took 200 years before it realized the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. Because for 100 years it allowed slavery, and then for another 100 years it allowed segregation. The French Revolution gave rise to the terror, and the use of the word terrorism is a French invention. The Soviet Revolution created a Politburo which ultimately could not maintain its hold on the people. And so these revolutions have a tendency to commit excesses for years before they play themselves out. And so my question to Ambassador Maulami is that all revolutions seem to be a revolt against the wider mass, against an elite. The elite being the people who are holding political or economic power. And you see this in the United States, because part of the Arab revolt is playing itself out in the United States in Zuccotti Park with Occupy Wall Street. It's the same concept of the mass revolting against the 1% elite. And so what is happening is that in all countries, including the most democratic ones, basically the power is held by an oligarchy or an elite, not by the masses. And so my question of Ambassador Al-Maulami is, in the Gulf, you have monarchies, and monarchies by definition are an elite. And so how is the Tunisian and Egyptian, or rather the Egyptian example, going to play itself out in the monarchies of the Gulf? And later on, of course, I will address the question to both of them as to how this is going to affect others. It is affecting the United States because people are questioning. It is going to affect Pakistan. It's going to affect other countries. And so whatever this day today that we are spending together with a dozen universities is an important day, because it will determine the future for each one of the young people at each of these universities. It gives me great pleasure to give the floor first to Ambassador Abdulla Al-Saidi, as a senior ambassador and future foreign minister, to tell us what is happening in Egypt and why did it happen.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Kamal. I believe senior ambassador, yes, but expected foreign minister, I don't think so. As Ambassador Kamal is very kindly referred to the fact that there has been 14 ambassadors here in New York. I'm number 15, and only 6 of them or 8 of them made it to the foreign minister. So I'm among those who are not going to make it, unfortunately, but maybe doing some other things. The question is, what happened in Egypt? What happened in Egypt, the answer to this question lies in the date where this all started. The whole events in Egypt have started on the 25th of January 2011. And the 25th of January is the police day. And for those who still remember the events of Ismailia in 1952 or 53, when our police forces stood to the British colonizers and combated back and managed to gain the freedom for Ismailia, that is the day that is devoted to police. So it all started as a demonstration in Tahrir Square against violations for human rights and fundamental freedoms. A series of events have already happened before that. Some of them happened during a defected electoral process for the elections of the parliament and the People's Assembly, as we call it. Some of it happened outside that context, and there is a famous incident that called Khalid Said incident in Alexandria that was among those that have heightened the tension and made young generation in particular take it to the streets in Tahrir Square and in many other squares in other capitals of other governors. This comes also on top of, it turned into a revolution in the period between the 25th and the 28th of January. As the president has taken things and taken command in responding to the requests and the demands of the young generations and the people in the street on the 25th of January by declaring a new government or by announcing that the parliamentary defected elections are going to be repeated. I think that this could have managed to contain the situation and could have managed to put Egypt in a much larger scale of reforms, a scale that would have been implemented in a much faster way. I will take you in a retrospective, and the elections of the People's Assembly that happened in November in 2010. This election was also marred with many frauds and many inaccurate reflections. And the fact that the National Democratic Party, the main party that the president belongs to, get about 98.9% of the seats in the parliament in the absence of any credible opposition, and at the time that the former parliament that was elected in 2005 had 88 members of the parliament from the Muslim Brotherhood, was also among the factors that have shown that the political scene is not in its best way, and that the National Democratic Party was trying to make sure that it has the absolute majority without any kind of competition from opposition parties. And we have been known of having political parties and opposition, and we having all rights and opportunities for women to participate in all aspects of the political life. And it was very strange to see that the elections of the parliament leads only to the election of the National Democratic Party representatives. Economic hardships played a role, but it did not play a role that as leading as it was, because it played a side role. And this side role, because at the time that you see statistics internationally that Egypt is making about 5.3 to 6% growth in the international economy, this did not trickle to the poor people down below. And that resulted in a feeling of frustration, creating an elite of the society that is gaining all the benefits of the reforms and all the benefits of the economic growth, and the majority of the people of middle class and poor people that do not feel that this is happening. So that was also another part. Another part was related to the political spectrum and the role of young generation. You see that the parliament has been headed by Dr. Surur for about 30 years. He has been the Speaker of the Parliament. The old generation has been taking command in all aspects of life, resulting in some way of stagnation and resulting on non-participation of young generation in the activities, whether it is political, economic, or social life. And that created also another feeling of anger and another feeling of boiling among the young generation. Added to that, and this might be the last point, which is the issue of the succession. That there was a feeling among the Egyptian population, and particularly among generations, that the president is trying to put his son to succeed him as president of the country, and that is why the president managed, and with the cooperation of the Minister of Interior and of other members of the government, managed to have the results of the parliament election to ensure that the whole parliament is going to support the succession process when it comes, taking into consideration that our president is about 84 years old, and that this requires some political move, and judging on some kind of comparison of what happened in Syria when President Assad died and the parliament met in the next day to amend the constitution to allow for the current President Bashar Assad to be elected at 35 years old, when the constitution was saying that the president should be 40 years old and above. And this, the combination of all this and the lack of action from the president from 25 to 28 January resulted into turning this, all which have started as demonstration against brutality and violations of human rights, and against economic situations, and against the fraud elections, and against the succession, into an all broken and all out revolution that led to the current situation. Thank you.
Ambassador Malami, you are from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia in its own way is also in the center of this Arab development, not just as a center of the Muslim world, but as a center of this development. Because what Ambassador Abdulaziz has said is that the main reason was political, not economic, and that the political reason was that there was a perpetuation of monarchies even in presidencies, that the presidencies were really bringing the sons of the president to take over from the president. So that is hereditary monarchy being exercised even in presidencies. And so what has happened as a result of this Arab development is that regimes have been changed. Regime change has spread around the world. And so it started with Tunisia and Egypt, but you can see the regime change in other places. You see it in Afghanistan, you see it in Iraq, you see it in Libya, you see it in a possibility of regime change in Syria. You see regime change outside the Arab world in Greece and in Italy. And so quite obviously there is a political move towards change that is taking place. But somehow you seem to be a very happy person, and you say, this is not going to affect me. I am constant like the northern star, because nothing is going to move me in Saudi Arabia. But you are surrounded by change. You have Yemen in the south, which is literally, the border is an open border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And Yemen is an old country which is spreading northwards the ideas. And in the north you've got Bahrain, which is again a place where you are trying to hold the change. And slightly further north is Jordan, one of the great allies of the West. And yet Jordan is on the move also. And so what gives you the impression that the monarchies in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, but also Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Emirat, what gives you the impression that they will not be affected by the efforts of Ambassador Abdulaziz? Who is the center of trouble, obviously.
I would never dare to say that we will not be affected. But first of all, let me thank you, Ambassador Kamal, for hosting me and for allowing me to join my colleague and great friend, Ambassador Abdulaziz. And I would like to thank all the professors and students at the various campuses. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to communicate with you this morning. As I said, I would never dare to say that change will not come to the Gulf states or to Saudi Arabia. Change is happening and is coming and has come and will continue to come. But if we look at the spread of the revolutions in Tunisia and elsewhere, and try to summarize and what Ambassador Abdulaziz was saying and build upon it, the main factors behind what has happened in these places, in my judgment, were First of all, the feeling of loss of dignity among people, the feeling of loss of opportunity, the feeling of hopelessness, the feeling of inability to participate and in shaping the future of themselves, their families, and their countries, and the fact that in many of these cases the population was feeling the heavy weight of repressive regimes that use military or police tactics to maintain not only law and order, but also to prevent any open debate about any of the issues that affect the nation. I think that these are the major factors, and the question then becomes, why did it take so long? And I think that is a more relevant question than why did it happen. It's just, how could it be that the Middle East was able, or that some of these regimes were able to sustain themselves in spite of the presence of these factors. Now, when it comes to the Gulf states, I would say recently there was a study conducted by Booz Consulting Group that evaluated what were the issues that the youth population in 3 Gulf states felt were most critical: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, 3 of the more affluent nations in the Gulf and in the region. And many of the issues were raised by the youth population there, were common to the youth anywhere. They talked about job opportunities, they talked about economic opportunity, they talked about support or opportunity for them to express themselves politically, and so forth. So the issues are the same. What is different in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia in particular and in the Gulf states, I think are 2 or 3 things. Number one, the fact that these states are governed by royal families also leads to the observation that these royal families have gained their legitimacy and widespread acceptance in the region through hundreds of years of being involved with the people in the various countries in which they rule. So they are not a new phenomenon. It is not a new president who came to power 20 or 30 years ago as President Assad of the late President Assad of Syria, and passed it on to his son, or a president who was, in the case of Tunisia, a police officer, and somehow he was able to manage to get to become the ruler of the country, or in Yemen, a sergeant in the army who ultimately becomes president and stays president for 20 or 30 years. The difference in the Gulf states is that the ruling families have been there for hundreds of years. They have offered symbols of stability. They have offered a unifying role, a unifying force that has accepted widespread allegiance from the population. The second difference is, of course, economic affluence. You do not find in Saudi Arabia and in the rest of the Gulf states the kind of deprivation that you would find in other countries, whether it is Yemen or Syria. And you do not find the squandering of wealth that you find in a country like Libya, where Libya, by any standards, would not have been considered a poor country, but somehow they have not been able to channel their wealth in the appropriate direction. Or Iraq at the era of Saddam Hussein, the same thing. You find that a lot of the wealth of the country is being channeled towards development, and the results are clear for anyone to see. The standard of living, the quality of healthcare, the quality of social services in the Gulf states is at a first world level and development. And third, you do not have in these states the kind of repressive, brutal force of a police state. Of course, you have concern for security, but you do not have the situation that you find in some of the other countries that we talked about, where a young policeman in the street can hold anybody and throw him in jail and slap him in the face, like what happened to Bouzizi in Tunisia, led him to put himself afire, set himself alight, and in fact, by doing so, started the entire process. The respect for human dignity, the respect for the individual, is not lacking in the Gulf states, evidenced by the fact that virtually any citizen can access the top leadership of the country, either the king or the provincial governors, and present his claim or present his complaint in one form or the other. So the three key factors, the lack of economic opportunity, the lack of dignity, the repressive state or the repressive nature of the state, are not present, in my opinion, in the Gulf states. Now, we will never be immune to change in the world, nor to change in the Arab world in particular, and we should not be. And I agree with you, Ambassador Kamal, that as Egypt goes the Arab world. And if Egypt succeeds, and I hope Egypt will succeed in establishing a well-functioning democracy, the impact of that on the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states, will be tremendous. It will be the impact of example. Egypt has always been a beacon for culture, for literature, for science and civilization in the Arab world, and it can be a beacon for democracy and the protection and development of human rights and the development of the forms of government that respond most appropriately to the people's demands and desires. And if that does happen in Egypt, then of course the impact of example will be tremendous throughout the Arab world, from the Gulf states in the east all the way to the Maghreb on the shores of the Atlantic.
But Ambassador Maulami, Ambassador Abdulaziz, you have referred, Ambassador Maulami, to the word affluence. And Ambassador Abdulaziz, his thesis is that affluence is not the key point. The key point was participation in the political decision making. And so the question is not whether you are affluent in the Gulf or not, but whether the man in the street is a participant in the decision making, in the political decision making. And I would like to bring you towards Bahrain, and Bahrain as a country which is more or less identical to Syria, because in both countries you have a small percentage ruling the country, and it does not matter whether they are monarchies or presidencies, and a large population which does not belong to this very small elite. And so the question that I want to ask is, you have said that the monarchies are very old, but the movement in the world is away from monarchy towards constitutional monarchy. Do you see that emerging at any time in the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, that monarchies give rise to constitutional monarchies with a greater participation of the public? You have the floor again, Ambassador Maulami.
Thank you. You raised three issues and I will address them very quickly. You talked about affluence and you said affluence was not a factor.
I didn't say it, Ambassador Abdulaziz.
Ambassador Abdulaziz. I think that even Ambassador Abdulaziz was referring to the fact that even though Egypt was actually achieving economic growth, that economic growth did not trickle down to the less fortunate sectors of society. And within these sectors of society, there was extreme deprivation in many cases, and they did not feel the value of the affluence or the growth in economic terms that the country as a whole was enjoying. So there was an unfair distribution of the results of the wealth that is being generated. In Saudi Arabia and in the rest of the Gulf states, a lot of the development activities are directed towards raising the levels and the standards of the least fortunate sectors of society, creating safety networks, creating social welfare programs, etc. So economic issues are a key issue in the process. They may not have been the sole driving force, but I think they continue to be an issue. Bahrain and Syria, I think there's a great difference in the two cases. The main difference is that in Bahrain you do not have the minority versus majority kind of situation. In Bahrain you have an almost equal distribution of, you're referring to the sectarian divide of Sunnis and Shi'is in Bahrain. And in Bahrain you had the major difference of having outside interference, of having an active involvement on the part of Iran to try to destabilize the regime in Bahrain and to try to create an Islamic Republic in Iran, in Bahrain. So there's a tremendous difference, I think, there. But finally, to your question, will the Gulf states move towards constitutional monarchy? Well, if what the question means, will the Gulf states move towards a greater level of public participation in government affairs, the answer to that is this is already happening. This is happening in Saudi Arabia, this is happening in the rest of the Gulf states. Now, we will have different paces, we will have different forms, but a process whereby people have much greater say in their affairs, where elections can be held for municipal councils, where women can participate at the highest levels of government, and so forth. All of that process is already taking place. It's part of the process of change that is happening in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states through evolution. It doesn't always have to be through revolution. Revolution carries with it, in many cases, as you have outlined in your introduction, long periods of turmoil and instability. And if a process can be done by evolutionary means, by consensus, by the acceptance of the various forces and sectors of society, by a leadership that is well responsive to the needs of the population and that is well not only accepted but aligned with the population, then that is probably a more secure and faster way of achieving the same objectives.
Ambassador Abdulaziz, back to Egypt. Egypt at the moment is being assured, its stability is being assured by a military government. We in Pakistan have a lot of experience of military governments because they have been the bane of Pakistan history for 3/4 of our total history. And our experience is that once the military comes into power, they don't let go. And so you somehow have the impression that the military is going to organize elections and is going to say, goodbye, sir, sorry, wrong number, I'm going home. But there is talk somewhere in the background all the time about something called the Turkish example. I want you to tell us what is this Turkish example, because it surprises me. Turkey, for an Arab, brings up the Ottoman Empire, and the Arabs have suffered from the Ottoman Empire. And the only thing that Arabs like about Turkey is the Turkish girls, who are very attractive. So they go there to marry the Turkish girls all the time. And Turkish kebabs. But what gives us the impression that the Turkish example is relevant in the case of Egypt? Because once again, if something happens in Egypt in a perpetuation of the army's presence, then that also is going to have a fallout effect on other countries.
I mean, the role of the army in Egypt has been earned and has been well respected all over the years. Egypt is totally different than Turkey. For Egypt, we have gone into many wars. We have gone into a war of 1956. We have gone into a war of 1967. We've gone into a war in 1973. And we hope that this is the last war that has been in our history. And throughout this period of wars, the military has gained the confidence of the people. And the military, even though it is not mentioned in the constitution and it is not mentioned in any of particular law, the military is having some sort of a balancing role within the Egyptian society. And that is why when the president decided to relinquish power, he handed over the authority to the military. and because he belonged to the military to start with. Second, that he knows that the military has a widespread respect in the street, and that they are going to be well regarded in the eyes of the Egyptian people to cover a transitional period and to lead into the process of electing a new civilian president and new parliament. And this is going to be the first time in our history that we will have a civilian president. It has always been the case and the discussion within our intellectuals and the parliaments that whether we should continue to have a president that belongs to the military all the time, or whether her time has come and have a civilian president. And nowadays, and after the revolution, the drive is to have a civilian president. Whether the civilian president has a military background, we all have military background, and we all have been transcribed into our armies or police forces, and we have this kind of experience. But the fact that we are moving into a civilian president is also a remarkable achievement. Whether the army is going to continue playing the same role, I would say yes. The army is going to continue to play the same role, and will continue to have the support of the Egyptian people also at the same time. So it is not meant to follow a certain model as the Turkish model. And if you have seen in the last month or two, when the whole military apparatus in Turkey leadership has already resigned, and the Prime Minister appointed a new set of leaders so as to ensure that there are adequate compatibility between what the policy of the state as reflected in the Prime Minister's authority and as reflected in the military authority as well, are compatible and are working hand in hand. And I think that this is what is going to be happening in Egypt in the near future.
We're going to open it for questions from the universities, starting with Arizona. Each university will give us 2 questions in quick order, and they'll both be answered together from this end. When Arizona comes online with questions, please speak loud so that the screen shifts automatically to Arizona. Over to Arizona.
Hi, I'm Delia Sines from Arizona State University, and my question is about the level of participation that we're seeing. Each of you mentioned that many of the people are involved and are really motivated by getting greater political participation in the decision-making of the countries. And I'm wondering, you did mention women, I'm wondering to what extent are women playing a role in the demonstrations, in the foreseeable near future, in terms of participation at higher government levels, and ultimately as leaders of country. Is that something that's coming down the line?
Women. I think this question should be addressed to Ambassador Al-Muallimi, because in Egypt women are tough. They are made of stainless steel. In Egypt they have been doing solid work. But I am not very sure about women in Saudi Arabia, because even though I know it for a fact that 51% of the wealth of Saudi Arabia is in the hands of women, and so they hold the money. But somehow, despite that, they can't drive, and I'm not sure whether they are part of the shura, of the advisory system of participation. You have the floor, sir.
Well, correction, they have 100% of the wealth of people in Saudi Arabia, because they control their own 51 and their husband's other 49. So they have that. But, and if women in Egypt are made of steel, women in Saudi Arabia are made of diamonds, which is the toughest metal at all. Let's put it this way. The level of participation of women in public affairs in Saudi Arabia has increased substantially over the past several years, particularly during the reign of King Abdullah, who took over the throne in 2005. We now have our first cabinet level minister. Of course, Egypt has had cabinet level ministers of women for tens of years, for decades, but we are developing in that process. We now have cabinet level female members of government. We have presidents of universities. We have women who have been participating in elections for boards of directors of chambers of commerce. We have them now in boards of major commercial banks and corporations. Women have now been given the right to vote in municipal elections and the right to nominate themselves as well for membership in municipal elections. Women will be part of the Shura Council, the Consultative Council of Saudi Arabia. So the role of women is growing in leaps and bounds in Saudi Arabia. Remember that this is the same country that until 1960 did not have a single government school for women. So if you compare that to the situation where we are today, in 1 or 2 generations, the leap has taken place in a relatively short period of time. I asked once the Speaker of Parliament in Luxembourg, and I asked him when was Parliament formed in Luxembourg. He gave me a date, and I said, when was the first woman elected to Parliament in Luxembourg? He gave me another date, 60 years later, and I told him, I can assure you that women's participation in parliamentary affairs and in government affairs in Saudi Arabia will take far less than the 60 years that it took a country in Central Europe, such as, or in Western Europe, such as Luxembourg, had to take. So the role of women in literature, in science, in public debate is now quite extensive in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's a process that takes time, it's a process that needs to overcome social difficulties, cultural difficulties, and in some cases simple logistical difficulties. But it's an irreversible process, and it is moving forward at an accelerated pace.
I would like to acknowledge what you have said, because my wife and I lived in Saudi Arabia for 6 years, and my wife was a professor at the university in Jeddah. And we found that the Saudi students, the girls, were far more serious and far better educated than the Saudi men, who had a tendency to relax a bit too much. And so the women were strong and serious. And whenever we asked them, but you may be very good, but you cannot drive. And the Saudi women would say to us, why do you want me to drive? I've got a chauffeur 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I am comfortable. Why do I need to drive myself? And so they have a point. But change is coming to Saudi Arabia, and I agree with the ambassador. The change is coming much faster than one had anticipated. We move to Bronx for 2 questions from there, followed by Lehigh. So Bronx Community College for 2 questions.
College, and my question is to the Saudi ambassador. And this suppression in the Gulf states, just like in Syria. And I would say the comparison between suppression in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and the contradiction between that and suppression in Bahrain, and why is that not the same as the two?
I think the question is about political developments on the eastern side of Saudi Arabia, particularly Bahrain. And I would like to add a supplementary. The impression here is that it is the Saudi army which has intervened in Bahrain. And that is external intervention. But when you talk to the Saudis, they say, no, it's not our army. It is a GCC. It's like the NATO intervention. And so it is not a Saudi intervention, but a GCC intervention, which is the truth between the two. Do you have a second question from Bronx?
Yes. This is a question again is for the Saudi ambassador. Now, an individual such as myself might be a little ignorant to Islamic culture. So I fear, please forgive me if this question sounds a bit ignorant. But given Saudi Arabia's heavy Islamic influence on not only culture, but on social construct, in what ways, if any, does Islam condone or justify the existence of a monarchy?
So second question, is monarchy compatible with Islam? Both questions to you, sir.
Thank you for the questioner. With regard to the first question, you talked about demonstrations in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, but if you keep in mind and if you look at television and find out what the demonstrations that have been held in Tahrir Square, in Tunisia, in Syria, in Yemen, every week or every day,
and Zuccotti Park,
and in the park here in New York and elsewhere, and compare that with the size of demonstrations that have been called for from time to time in Saudi Arabia, there is absolutely no comparison. A few hundred people try to go out to the streets, and of course police try to maintain order in the streets and try to prevent disruption and so forth, but there have been no violent clashes of any magnitude, and there have been no sizable demonstrations of any magnitude throughout the so-called Arab Spring in Saudi Arabia. So whatever has happened is a further indication to the fact that in Saudi Arabia we did not need to go to the streets to communicate our wishes or desires, because there are alternative channels of communication that are wide open to various people. In Bahrain, the situation is different, because in Bahrain there is clear evidence of foreign intervention on the part of the Iranians. They felt that Bahrain was the weak link of the Gulf states, and the Gulf states said no, Bahrain cannot be seen as the weak link, and as such Gulf-wide troops from Saudi Arabia and from the United Arab Emirates and from Qatar and elsewhere went into Bahrain at the request of the Bahraini government, not to quench the riots, not to get into confrontation with Bahraini citizens, but simply to protect the strategic interests of Bahrain against any potential foreign or foreign-inspired invasion. They protected the oil fields, they protected the refinery, they protected the airport, the strategic installations in Bahrain. But never at any time did any soldier from Saudi Arabia or from the other Gulf states came into contact with a Bahraini citizen who may have been demonstrating in the street. As to the second question, does Islamic law condone monarchy? I think the answer is obvious in history, yes. There is no contradiction between the two. Islam as a way of life has not come out with detailed solutions for political affairs. Islam, the major principle in Islam on these issues is a statement made by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, you know better how to handle the affairs of your life, and it is left for each society to decide what is the political structure that is most suitable for that society. In Saudi Arabia, a new king or a new crown prince is given the allegiance, is the pledges of alliance from the population based on his commitment to Islamic Sharia and Islamic law. And this alliance this allegiance is conditional on that proviso. And if you make that conditionality, then obviously the link becomes clear and strong, and there is no reason to consider that there is any contradiction.
Over to Lehigh for two questions, followed by Lockhaven.
Good morning, ambassadors. My name is Craig Peoples from Allentown Central Catholic High School. My question is, how do you think Iraq's future will play out after the U.S. armed forces leave?
I'm sorry, I missed it.
Iraq future.
Which university is talking now? You said high school.
Lehigh University.
Lehigh. Yes, repeat your question, please.
My question is, how do you think Iraq's future will play out after the United States armed forces leave?
Oh, great question. Second question, if any.
My name is Susie Nair. I would like to ask, what role do you believe technology played in the Arab Spring, and will that technology continue to play a role in civic life?
Okay, technology and Iraq. May I request all the universities that the word Arab Spring, it's nice and catchy, but it's not a correct depiction of what happened. There's a change taking place in the Arab world, Arab developments, but to believe that Arab society is going through a spring is wrong. This is a very old society. It has had its spring, it's had its summer, it's had its autumn, it's had its winter, it's had a lot of history behind it. So to give the impression that Arab society is just being born in a spring today is a false impression. And that's why it's okay to use a journalistic term, but it is not quite a correct depiction of what is happening in the Arab world. But the question is, Iraq. The Ambassador Al-Malami, you spoke about foreign intervention. I don't want to embarrass the country on whose soil we all stand, but their intervention has been very serious in all the changes that have taken place in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and possibly in Syria. And so the question is that foreign intervention is a very strong influence in the change which is taking place in the Arab world. But now in Iraq we went in, and I think we went in under false pretenses, because we said there are weapons of mass destruction, which was nonsense. Then we said we are going in because of other human rights violations which had occurred 12 years ago or 13 years ago, at which time no action was taken. And so basically the desire was regime change. And now, having done that regime change, in other words, QED, we've solved the problem, now we pull out. But is the new regime in Iraq likely to be able to maintain itself after the withdrawal of American forces, one? And number two, are American forces really going to withdraw? Because I think they're not going to withdraw. They're probably just going to go back a bit to Bahrain or to Kuwait and be there to come in immediately as and when needed. And number three, the American intervention in Iraq, other than regime change, resulted in one and only one immediate and strong result. And that was the strengthening of Iranian influence in Iraq and in the region. And so it seems to me that that this is a bigger event, in fact, than the Arab developments itself, because the strengthening of Iran has a much greater impact on the whole region than just the changes inside the Arab world. So who would like to take on these difficult questions? Ambassador Abdulaziz, you start.
Well, I mean, how Iraq's future will play out, I think we'll have to wait and see. Iraq has had, as Ambassador Kamal, a foreign intervention factor in deciding what happened during the past period of time. This resulted in some delicate balance between the Sunni, the Shiites, the Kurds, and in a manner that resulted in a specific way of formulating government and in a specific way of elections that led to constitutional and legislative councils and parliaments. And that is going to be very much fragile, and we'll need to watch how this is going to play out. The Iranian factor from one side and the Turkish factor from another are going to be also very decisive in dealing with those issues, particularly with regard to the Kurdish areas in the north, and with regard to those adjacent areas to Iran, and with the Iranian very well-known relation and influence with the Shiites in Iraq, as we were just talking about the Iranian interrelationship with Shiites in Bahrain and in many other parts of the Arab world. So I believe that that Iraq is going to be stable at the beginning, but whether those kind of disputes and those kind of balances are going to be maintained for long, I hope that these are going to be looked at in a much more sober way and in a much more peaceful way to ensure that the interrelationship between the Sunni, the Shiite, and the Kurds do not lead to some kind of civil war or do not lead to some kind of clashes between the believers of the three directions. That is what I can say on Iraq.
Ambassador Maulami, would you like to add to this and to the other question?
I think the American invasion of Iraq of 2003 was a most unfortunate event. Saudi Arabia has opposed it since the beginning, not only because it was based on false premises, but also because of the enormous cost in life and material wealth to the United States, but more importantly also because of the size of the loss to the Iraqi people. Several 100,000 people have been killed in Iraq. The wealth of Iraq has been squandered. It has not been able to use the time for development. The structures of Iraqi society and state were destroyed. The new structures that were being built on ethnic and sectarian basis, which reverses a lot of progress that has been made not only in Iraq but also in the Arab world towards moving away from these divisions and so forth. So the whole episode has been very, very unfortunate and a big mistake for the United States and for everybody who has participated in that. Now, that doesn't mean that the Americans should not pull out of Iraq, because the original purpose of the American presence in Iraq was unjustified, and therefore the only reasonable thing to do is to bring this to an orderly end as early as possible and to move forward. Now, where does Iraq go from there? It all depends on the Iraqi people. The current structures in Iraq, unfortunately, are based on a sectarian balance of power and sharing of positions and so forth. It is not aimed at developing a national identity, and I think that is not in the interest of Iraq. It gives the Iranians an opportunity to expand their influence tremendously in Iraq, and again, that is not in the interest of Iraqi society. I hope that just as Egypt can be an inspiration for Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, that Egypt can also be an inspiration for Iraq to develop towards more representative democracy, to develop towards the development of a national identity, to develop towards forming structures of national unity that does not evaluate people on their ethnicity or on the basis of their religion or sect, but that evaluates people on the basis of their qualifications and capability and their commitment to the country. Whether that happens or not is really up to the Iraqis to decide, and we can only hope that they will make the right choices, and that we in the Arab world and all those who care for Iraq should stand ready to help guide and assist the Iraqis in reaching such a goal peacefully and in a positive manner, I believe.
The Iraqi question was so important that we've lost track of the second question from...
I have it. I mean, that's it. The second question, the role of the technology in what is happening in the Arab world.
You are the boss.
I mean, of course, technology played a significant role in what happened in Egypt, and I can speak about that more than anybody else. And social media tools have been widely used in communication between people who have been going out in demonstration places in Tahrir Square, in Manshia Square in Alexandria, and in many other places around the country. And even when the government decided to cut the internet, it played and this resulted in cut of or in cessation of those social media instruments. This added much more numbers of the people to the street, because people realize that there is really a serious situation that has led the government to cut all kinds of communication through social media, and whether it is Twitter, Facebook, internet, or other ways. So social media, as much it can play a leading role as a means of communication and as a means of sending signals to other sectors of society, and it played a significant role in mastering and organizing the revolution in Egypt.
Let's take a question or two from Lockhaven. I'm not sure whether Mercy is online, but if they are, I'll go to Mercy after Lockhaven.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're just going to defer in essence of time and have one question.
Good afternoon. My name is Ray Anderson. I'm a freshman. My question was, do you think the Occupy Wall Street movement in America has any chance of prompting the same large-scale effect of the Arab Revolution?
It depends on you, doesn't it? Because you are sitting wherever you are and not on Zuccotti Park. And so the question is, are you affected by what is happening in Zuccotti Park? If you are affected, then Zuccotti Park becomes Tahrir Square, because the basic requirement is the same. The Zuccotti Park is the 99% reacting against the 1%. And is it truly 99%, or is it just a bunch of 100 people or 500 or 1,000 people in Zuccotti Park and in a dozen other parks in the United States? In other words, is this a spreading revolt or not? And the answer to whether it is spreading or not can only be given by you. Are you affected? Are you are at Lockhaven, are you coming out to occupy a square in Lockhaven in support of Zuccotti Park? If not, then Zuccotti Park is just an isolated incident, because it can succeed only if it comes out with a manifesto, and a clear manifesto of what it wants. All the revolutions which have taken place in the Arab world had a clear objective, and that objective was achieved. But in Zuccotti Park, there is just dissatisfaction but no objective. And then there is no manifesto and no leadership, so I don't know how much it can be sustained. It's all very nice to go and camp in Public Square in New York, particularly when the weather is good. But when the weather turns bad, it becomes a bit more difficult. Over to Mercy for a question, if Mercy is online.
Okay, the first question is about the Egyptian incident. What we look at is that many of the young people revolting, many of them were illiterate, and one of the things that I'm concerned about is, how do their voices get heard? What about this power void? How do we look at this, and do we see that there will be some kind of unified movement to have their voices heard? The question, you mentioned Zuccotti Park or the Occupy Wall Street. One of the big problems they have is the fact that they don't have an ideology where they have a mission statement that is narrow. So what about these people having their voices heard? What about the Muslim Brotherhood coming in and filling this void, and they end up in a situation worse than they started?
Second question.
Hi, my name is Hiba Hassan and I'm from Bahrain. I have born and raised in Bahrain. I have a question for the Saudi ambassador. Well, you said that the main difference between Bahrain and Syria is that there is no minority versus majority, because the two main sects in Bahrain are equal. Well, I believe that it's not true, because the majority in Bahrain belong to one sect, and which is Shi'i, and the minority in Bahrain is Sunni. And you said that the second difference is that outside interference, which is coming from Iran. Well, okay, the name of Iran is everywhere, but at the same time, what do you think of the Saudi interference in Bahrain? Okay, you said that the Bahrain government asked the government of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE to send their troops. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, you said that all those governments from the Gulf came to protect Bahrain and protect the oil fields, protect the safety. Well, and I want to say that as a Bahraini citizen, that is not true. The Saudi government came to kill the people in Bahrain. They didn't come to protect the safety in Bahrain. I'm a citizen there, and I've seen lots of Saudi soldiers in Bahrain, and they are all masked. No Saudi soldier have ever exposed his face. Why? Why is that? They're coming to kill the people there.
Okay.
So what do you think of all of this? Thank you.
Yeah, we've got both the questions. You take the first one.
Okay, well, how do we ensure that the voices are going to be heard after the Egyptian revolution? I think that if you follow closely what has been happening, that all freedoms has been opened for establishment of parties, freedom of association, freedom of demonstration. Then the freedom of expression is guaranteed. There is no single day since the revolution started where you don't find demonstrations happening in Egypt to express demands, to express complaints, to ask for certain changes to be taking place. And since we opened up this process, there has been about 47 new political parties that has been established, including about 17 parties that are established by young generations and by their gatherings and organizations that are mounting to about 160 youth organizations at the time being. So the freedom of expression and the political freedoms are already there, and they are going to play its role in the parliamentary elections that are going to start on the 28th of this month. If you look at the lists that are presented by many parties, you will find that at least half of each list is youth, and you will find that at least 1/3 to 1/2 of those lists that are presented are women. So with regard to participation of young generation and of women, these are already guaranteed. Other question related to Muslim Brotherhood or Jihad al-Islami or other organizations, they have already established their own new parties after they have been prohibited under the older regime, and those parties are coming to the elections with candidates. But my expectations is that they're not going to get more than 25 to 30% of the seat, because the Egyptian people and the Egyptian society is not built only on religious considerations, but it is built also on platforms and plans to achieve better future to the people. And I think that the Egyptian young generation and the Egyptian population that have already gone to the streets to do the revolution is much more sober, that we do not need at this direction, at this juncture, an extra or ultra Islamic direction that is going to take us backward than it's going to take us forward. Thank you.
Ambassador Maulami, on Bahrain, the real question is not what happened, but if you can project Bahrain 5 years forward and tell me 5 years from today, will the majority which feels that it does not have enough role in decision making, will it have a greater role in decision making, and will matters have settled down, let us say 5 years from today?
Well, this is a matter for the Bahrainis to decide. First of all, I personally don't like the numbers game of how many Shiites and how many Sunnis are there, because for hundreds of years, Shias and Sunnis have lived together in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, and other places of the Arab world without really noting this divide at all. It is only when Iran is trying to use this divide to fan its objectives in the region that it has created this awareness and I might add, among a relatively small segment of the Shia population. Most of the Shias in Bahrain and elsewhere in the Arab world are citizens of their own country, loyal to their countries, and have the same desires and wishes of everybody else. Even in Syria, where the Alawites constitute about 5 or 6% of the population, I don't think that the revolution there is targeted at Alawites per se, or is because the president is Alawite. If the president was a Sunni Muslim with the same repressive machinery, I think the revolution would have been just as fierce. Look at Tunisia, look at Egypt, look at Libya, and so forth. So that divide, I think, is a trap that we should never fall into. With regard to Saudi interference, as I said, Saudi interference was, as the questioner also confirmed, was upon the request of the government of Bahrain. And I can challenge anybody to prove that Saudi citizens have killed a single Bahraini citizen or even came into contact with a single demonstrator. That is totally not correct. As to the question of the future of Bahrain, as I said, this is a matter for the Bahrainis to decide. The Bahraini government is holding a broad national dialogue. It has offered to grant an elected parliament substantially expanded authorities and to form a government from the elected parliament and so forth. And I believe that indicates that in Bahrain and elsewhere in the Arab world and in the Gulf states in particular, we will see a continuous development towards a more representative system that incorporates all segments of society.
We're running short of time. We've got about 12 minutes left and we still have 6 places to go to. So quick questions and quick answers. Okay, we go to Towson for 2 questions from Towson.
We're good? Sir, my name is Alexandra Woodfin. I'm a freshman studying economics and French. Our question for you is, there has been talk in the United States about how the Arab Spring may not work out in U.S. interests. How can your governments play a stronger role in resisting U.S. pressure, seeking its own interests in the Middle East over the people?
Okay. Second question, if any.
Yes. Has the Arab Spring affected people's perception of human rights, which in some countries have been rejected as Western ideology?
On the first, I don't see how the developments in the Arab world should be questioned or not questioned by the United States. The United States has its interests. I understand them. The Arab world has its own interests. And so the Arab world will go forward depending on its interests, not on the interests of the United States or of China or of Pakistan or Mongolia. And so it appears to me that we must give absolute legitimacy to the desires of the Arabs for how they want to change or not change their society. And I don't think outside influence should be allowed to have anything other than a partial desire. I can understand the United States having desires, but I don't understand the United States trying to determine the future of what happens in the Arab world. Would you agree or disagree with me?
I would agree. I would agree with that, yeah.
I would fully agree with that. I do, however, recognize, as you do, Ambassador Kamal, that the United States has major strategic interests in the region, will follow the developments in the region very closely, will try to protect and promote its own interests, and I think that's a legitimate desire on the part of the United States. And where those interests coincide with the interests of the Arab world, so should we. And I think that is a natural process of evolution of interests and the joining of hands in a cooperative manner wherever opportunities for that may arise.
Yes, but let us be quite clear of what is the US interest. The US wants access to oil because they have a love affair with cars. And so they want oil and they want it cheap and they want it stable. And in order to do that, they also have a strategic ally in the region, which is Israel. And so the United States cannot allow oil to be threatened or Israel to be threatened. And I think that is a legitimate American interest. But I don't see how the Arab world or the Arab majority can not take its own view of how it wants to develop in future. And that was the point that I wanted. And since the question is also about human rights, I think that is human right for the Arab person, the Arab individual or the Arab collectivity to define its own interests. That is human rights.
Yeah, if I may say that it is not only playing in favor or not in favor of the United States, it should play in favor of the Arab people themselves. That's what what is being said. And that requires also that the United States play more significant role in brokering the peace in the Arab world. And that is that. So if the United States is keen on keeping better relations with the new governments and the new parliaments and the new direction the Arab world is going, then it has to exert maximum effort in order to achieve peace in the Middle East. And something that we are seeing now, that there is no direction that it is going in the right place.
I go quickly to Fairleigh Dickinson at Vancouver in Canada. And congratulations to you once again for waking up so early in Vancouver to join us in New York. Quick question.
Good morning. So, to the Saudian ambassador, you said that the ruling families are a symbol of stability and not sources of repressive force. But what would you say about the seizing of profitable businesses? And doesn't this, I guess, act against the government and would cause and can push people to revolt like in other Arab states?
Seizing what?
I didn't get the question. Are you saying that that the Saudi monarchy has been confiscating companies?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Second question.
You mentioned that Egypt will likely have its first civilian president. Who will be included as a civilian in the presidential election, and how will the candidates be chosen? Will there be regulations in place, and if so, who will these regulations exclude?
Ambassador Al-Saidi, have you been confiscating firms and companies from ordinary citizens?
Saudi Arabia has a tradition of an open, free economy and markets for decades, ever since the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We are subjected to close coordination with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the United Nations, with other agencies and organizations, and there has never been a single case of confiscating property, whether it is companies or any personal property. The protection of private capital in Saudi Arabia is sacred and is central to the economic system of Saudi Arabia. Either I did not understand the question fully, or the questioner may have been misinformed about any particular situation that may have been on the questioner's mind.
Second question.
Presidential elections in Egypt is going to be done after about a year or a year and a half. What we're starting with is the parliamentary election on the 28th of this month, which is going to run through up till the middle of March. And then there will be a year to draft a new constitution, which will decide whether Egypt will continue to go with the presidential system or will go with the governmental system, meaning that the prime minister will be that will govern the country, and the president is going to be an honorary president, as it is in many other places. And then the elections of the president are going to take place, because it has to take place on a clear understanding what are the job classifications of the president vis-a-vis the prime minister, and what is the new system that is going to be followed by the country. But nonetheless, we have up till now about 17 potential candidates for the president. including, if you know, Amr Moussa, the former Secretary General of the Arab League, including Mohammed al-Baradei, and former ambassador, including Mohammed al-Baradei, former ambassador as well, and that was the Director General of the IAEA, including someone from the Muslim Brotherhood, Muhammad Abu Futuh, including many people from all walks of life. So there are no restrictions whatsoever on who is going to be candidate, but still, yet this is going to be the phase or a stage that's coming after a year or year and a half.
I'm going to go first to TNEC now, and then come back to Madison at the end to have questions and to close. So to TNEC for questions from that end.
Hello, ambassadors. My name is Jamal Jefferson, and just recently the European Union has put sanctions on Syria for the human rights abuses. Do you agree with their actions or not condone them?
Ambassador Al-Moallemi, Saudi Arabia has been very strong in its condemnation, so tell us.
Well, we have been very strong in our condemnation of the practices of the Syrian regime. We have supported the initiative of the Arab League. The initiative of the Arab League for resolving the situation in Syria calls upon several steps to be taken and calls upon economic sanctions to be considered at the appropriate time. We think that the European Union or the other international players should give space for the Arab League to lead the process and should provide its support to the steps that are taken by the Arab Leagues, which have been quite firm and quite aggressive in the past few days, and should help in that process rather than disrupt it or compete with it.
Did TNEC have a second question? If not, I'll go to
Yes,
Madison.
sir.
But go ahead, TNEC, second question.
Ambassador Kamal, Ambassador Abdulaziz, good morning. Good to see you again. Ambassador Moallemi, welcome. Question, it seems like this Iranian-Saudi Arabian conflict does not have any substance. It's just an exchange of accusations, and we really cannot prove an Iranian influence in the region. At the same time, we could let's suppose there is a plan to an Iranian plan to expand. At the same time, there is a Saudi Arabian plan to expand, and the latest invitation of Morocco and Jordan to be added to the GCC is an indication of that. My question is, since to me this seems to be like just a Shia Sunni sort of conflict, are there any efforts to absorb the Iranian influence by actually forming an alliance with the Iranians, especially that Saudi Arabia and Iran and several other Arab countries have a threat in common, and that threat is called Israel? Thank you.
Let me take this question because I have studied this a bit. Iran is a Shia country, which means that it has a chain of command coming down from the Ayatollah. It's like the Catholic Pope. The Sunnis are Protestants. In other words, every Sunni has a hotline straight with God. And so that is the difference between the two. Now, in this, you have a long history in the Muslim world of those who believe in that chain of command being from the top down, and those who believe that it should be horizontal with everybody having a hotline. And in that, there is no doubt that while Iran has never been an expansionist country, the fact remains that Iran has interests which are, and not expansionist, but which are going to dominate the region, because Iran is 80 million people. It is the largest population. It is an educated population. It has a very high rate of participation of women in education, and it has that vertical structure. So Iran has a growing role in the whole region. No country other than Saudi Arabia has made greater efforts to come closer to Iran, because constant talks are taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So don't be under the impression that this is an India-Pakistan situation. Not at all. The Saudi foreign minister has repeatedly spoken to the Iranians, and at the head of state level there have been conversations. So while the interests may be slightly divergent, the dialogue is absolutely constant, And the dialogue is the positive thing that we should be looking at, rather than trying to see the world as divided between Shias and Sunnis. That is how we should see things. I'm going to move straight to Madison for questions. From Madison.
Okay. Good morning, ambassadors. Thank you for coming. My question is about Syria. The UN has claimed that the Syrian government has claimed about 3,500 lives since the protest started. Do Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other Middle Eastern countries have any thoughts on Syria's President Al-Assad being called to step down to power and his responses of using heavy gunfire on protesters? And your thoughts on what the outcome will be with the protests?
Second question.
Hi. Well, my question is, if women are allowed to vote, will there be any restriction from, let's say, husbands or other male people in the family, and will they force them to choose what the male choose as a candidate, and what other and what actions can be done to prevent this?
I'll take the second question myself, because having been married for 48 years to a woman who's made of stainless steel, I can tell you that she determines who I should vote for, rather than the other way around. So don't talk to me about men dominating women. I have been dominated by my wife for 48 years. And as you can see, my hair was totally black until I got married. And look at its color now, as a result of being dominated by women. But on the other question, I leave it to Syria. The question is, I want to add a supplementary to that. We are all talking against what is happening in Syria, because repression is taking place. But have we given any thoughts to what could happen after Mr. Bashar al-Assad? Because it's easy to throw people out, but determining what comes after that is extremely difficult, as we know from Egypt. And so, Ambassador Al-Mawlavi, please go first.
Thank you. Well, Saudi Arabia has not called for Mr. Assad to resign. We don't think that it is our business to choose presidents of other countries. Who governs Syria is a question for the Syrians to decide. We have condemned the repression. We continue to do so. We have led the effort along with Egypt and other Arab countries to try to find a solution. We have called for substantial reform to be introduced to Syria, political reform. We have called for multi-party presidential and parliamentary elections to be held. If those elections are held and if they were to be organized under transparent and free circumstances, and if the Syrian people choose Mr. Assad to be president, good for them. It's up to them to decide how should that happen. But what we strongly oppose is the repressive practices, is the killing of innocent civilians and so forth. And that addresses the other question that Ambassador Kamal is raising. What happens afterwards is for the Syrians to have their own ability to choose and to exercise their free will as they see appropriate.
Ambassador Abdulaziz, can I ask you a difficult question on Syria? That the developments on Syria seem to have a lot of external intervention also, because there's too much external media watching Syria. Is this really because of developments in Syria, or is it because Syria is seen as a major danger to Israel?
No, I mean, let me start by saying that the international community and the Security Council and the United Nations did not deal with Syria for about 15 days at the very beginning, because everybody was wondering what is going to happen. Syria has occupied lands, it's very adjacent to Israel, and any destabilization of Syria might end up into some breakout of some violence or breakout of some military actions that might put the whole area in danger. So that is why there was a little bit more confusion among the international community in how to deal with Syria to start with. but coming with a draft resolution that has been put before the Security Council and suffered from 2 vetoes from the Russian Federation and China, this made the Syrian authorities think that they are beyond reach, and that intensified the casualties that has been referred to now to more than 3,500. But we in Egypt, we did not call for any for Bashar al-Assad, President Assad, to step down, and we are calling for non-interference, no foreign intervention in the Syrian business. We think that this is an Arab problem, and I think that the decision that was taken by the Arab League on the 12th of this month has already taken some measures by suspending the participation of Syria in the meetings of